We're back with Photoshop CC, the ultimate guide. And I want to take a look back at what we've done thus far, because we've done quite a bit up until now. On the first week, we started with some essentials. We gave you a quick overview of Photoshop, of how to think about the interface to start with. Then we jumped right into adjusting images with Camera Raw, went into selections, layers, masks. Good foundation. Then in the second week, we explored more adjustments and retouching. Now popping into the third week, we have our filters, masking, and we started getting into things a little bit more advanced. Well, now we're in week 4. Since we've covered that much ground, we can start getting into the more unique and different features that are found within Photoshop. And today, we're starting our last week together. And for our first session of the last week together, we're going to get into warping, blending, and liquifying. And so let's jump right into Photoshop and get started. Here I have an image. What I would like to do is I would like to insert something else into the scene. The problem is, if I were to take, let's say, a car and put it on the road here, I'd need to make sure I chose a car that was shot from a similar angle, wouldn't I? In order to make it look appropriate. Well, I don't have a picture that was shot at an appropriate angle. So we're going to have to use a car, it's actually a bus, that isn't shot from the right angle and somehow make it look as if it was at the right angle. So let's take a look at how to accomplish that. I'll go over to Bridge, and here's the image I'm going to use. Now, if I just drag that over there, I think it actually might be a little small, but we'll find out. One way to open an image is just drag it onto Photoshop, but I'll drag this over. It's a little small. I'll scale it up. Usually scaling up is not the most ideal, but in this case, I need to be able to show you how to get it in there. So we'll move it up. It'll be all right. And I'll move it over. Now, if I simply remove the background on this, if you look at the angle, the surface that the bus is positioned on, and you look at the perspective of it, and you compare it to this, it's not going to quite look right. We'll find out, though. Let's do a quick job of removing the background. And by the way, this used to be my home. I lived on this bus for 7 or 8 years. I don't remember how many years now. But I have since sold it. I know, aw. But we're going to make a quick selection. At the moment, I'm using the quick selection tool. I'm not going to get my selection to be absolutely perfect because it just takes a little bit more time to do so. And I'd rather concentrate our time on learning how to bend and liquify things than how to select things, because we had multiple sessions on how to do that. Now I can type the letter Q to get quick mask mode and then just touch this up a little bit, because I see that the mirror on the bus is not selected. It's covered in red still. And it might be that I need to touch up the top. But I can do that by getting a small brush. I'll click on one edge of the top of the bus. I'll hold Shift and I'll get the back edge, because that's a straight line on the top of the bus. So it's relatively easy to fix that. Just touch up a few other little areas, and it might be that I come in here and get just a little bit more tire. Oops, get a little more tire. I'll hold, press the letter X to exchange my foreground and background colors, and I will say this is good enough once I get the bottom of the bus to disappear, the ground. All right, that's going to be good enough for our purposes, and now I'm going to add a layer mask. So the layer mask will remove the background, and now you get a sense that the angle just doesn't feel right, to me at least. It doesn't feel like three-dimensionally it would be in the right position. So before I make any changes, though, I'm going to turn this into a smart object so that whatever I do is not permanent. It's something where if I need to fine-tune it later, I can go back in and it remembers exactly where I was in the process. Now, I don't usually go to the layer menu to turn things into a smart object because it's just harder to find the choice. If you go to the filter menu, Convert for Smart Filters does the exact same thing. It just converts your layer into a smart object. So if you watch my layers panel, you'll find that that layer mask will get incorporated into the layer, so it will only show me what it would look like if I did what's known as rasterize that or render it. So you see the background looks like it's gone. If I were to actually double click on that layer though, I'd still see the mask in there. I can still refine it later. Then I'm going to go to the Edit menu, and that's where I'm going to find a choice we haven't used yet, and it's called Perspective Warp. When I choose Perspective Warp, it will give me a little bit of guidance here. It's even animated to try to help me out in how you would work with this feature. Unfortunately, I personally find that the help is not detailed enough. So let's just close that, and I'll show you how to use this feature. I'm going to zoom up on what we have, and I need to educate Photoshop about how perspective is affecting the bus right now. I'm going to do that by coming out here and clicking, and when I click, I will get a rectangle like this. If I hit delete, I can get rid of it. If I click and drag, I can specify the size of that rectangle, and I'm going to get it close to the size of the front of the bus. But right now, you notice that the rectangle is straight on. It isn't distorted by perspective at all. And I need to grab the corners here and get that rectangle to be distorted by perspective the same way that the bus is. So I'm going to get this right on the corner of the bus, up near the top, and I'm going to get it so that line that's going across the top of the bus, right across here, is parallel with anything else that would be parallel to the ground on the bus. I'll get it so this vertical line here is parallel with the vertical corner of the bus. And I might extend out this a little bit because the edge of the bus actually goes out a little further, at least at the bottom. And I want to get that vertical line that's being created right here that is currently at the wrong angle. I need it to line up with whatever the vertical would be on the bus. And by doing so, I'm going to educate Photoshop about how that particular surface is being distorted by perspective. I can grab the edges and pull them out. By grabbing the edges, it's not going to change the angle. It just changes the area that this covers. And I think I'm relatively close as far as if you look at the grid that's in here. I might need to fine-tune it a little bit because I do notice this one grid line here deviates from the horizontal lines in the bus. Anything that would be parallel to the ground on the bus, these lines should be parallel to. And so when I see the ribbing on the front of the bus, that tells me I either need to bring this dot down to about there or bring the top dot up, depending on what's needed. But I think now we're getting close to having that match. Just fine-tune until we get pretty darn close. Then I can draw a second box. If I move my mouse far away and draw a box, the two won't be connected together. But if I move my mouse close to a box that's already there, then I might get it to snap. Do you see how the blue, there's a blue kind of guide showing up both on the grid that's already there and on mine? So when I let go, they become one. They connect to each other. That's only going to happen if you start really close to the one that was already there. Then I can grab these corners, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to get the line at the top to line up with the top of the bus, so it's at the same angle. And I'm going to get the line at the bottom so that all the horizontal grid lines within this are parallel to whatever would be parallel with the ground on ground level. So I'm looking at the base of those dark black windows on the side of the bus, and do you see the line that's just above their edge? If I move this down too far, you see that the line doesn't line up with all the windows. If I bring it up right about here, it's starting to line up with those. And then I'm swinging this back and forth so that that vertical line at the back of the grid is parallel with whatever would be vertical on the back of the bus. Once I have that, I can again grab the edges and pull on them if I need to. Got to be careful though when I pull down here. If I happen to pull down this far, do you see what happened to the front of the bus? This no longer lines up because it affected that corner as well. So if I wanted to do that, needed to, I'd need to fine-tune this and bring this down just as low. And it's not important that it's right on the edge of the bus. It's important that the lines that are being created by these grids are parallel with the elements that would be parallel with the ground. And so I'm looking there to make sure those line up. Same with over here. So I think I'm doing okay. Now, if you look up here in the upper left, we were using this tool right here. That's going to lay out our shapes, where we define our various surfaces. then the next icon over is when we can actually change the image. And so it's trying to give us a little bit of help here, telling us what to do, but all it's telling us to do is move the pins. And sure, I'll do that. You only get that help, I believe, the first time you use this. Now, watch what happens when I grab each pin and pull on it. You see how it can change the perspective of what we have. So what I want to do is possibly look at the scene that we have. And do you see this line that's here? And you see this line that's here? Well, I want to try to get this so it looks like it's using similar perspective to the building. I'll probably get the back of the bus to be relatively vertical because the verticals on the building are pretty straight. I wasn't tilted up or down when I shot the building. The front of the bus should probably have something similar where these are vertical as well. They're not at a weird angle, that type of thing. And then for the front of the bus, I could look at the building itself. Like if you look at how these symbols, if you were to connect them together, the angle they would be at, or if you look at this roof line and see its angle, I might want to somewhat mimic that. And the back of the bus, though, doesn't quite look right. I think I'm going to have to pull it out that way. And you get the idea, though, that I can, look, I can go, hey, all sorts of things, and I can set this up. Now, later on, I'll show you how to create a perspective grid. And if you create a perspective grid, then we can have a grid laying on top of our image that shows us what angles this should be at. And if I were to do that, then I wouldn't be guessing as much and kind of eyeballing it here. Instead, I'd have an actual grid. Just like when I was putting the grid on top of the bus and I was trying to get it so the lines were parallel with the parts of the bus, I'd be moving this until the edges of each side would be parallel with my perspective grid. But we'll do that once we're done with this and on a different image. But it will give you an idea of how to accomplish it. And if I come in here, I can grab any one of these lines and manipulate as much as I want. Since I have a smart object, I can also return to this as many times as I want. I just press return or enter to say I'm done, and then I will just go back up to the edit menu, choose perspective warp a second time, anytime in the future, and I can fine tune it. If I didn't have a smart object, though, I'd have to redefine those grids each time. But with a smart object, it remembers them. Was there a question? I thought I saw somebody.
Well, my question, I think you somewhat answered it by saying that we can actually put a grid on there. If we're not able to eyeball the vertical and the horizontal lines, is there any type of a tool besides the grid, kind of like a level on a, that you would, the little bubble level that you would see on a tool? Is there something like that besides a grid that's available?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. As far as we can do something like with the pen tool, we can draw lines, but we can't move those lines while we're in this particular feature, and therefore it's not as useful to have. But once you learn how to create a perspective grid, you would just have a grid, you'd have a bunch of grid lines on your screen, and you'd just be moving these until they're parallel with those grid lines. And it could be helpful. Here, I just moved the bus down a little bit so I could see this angle right here in the building. Do you see that angle? I was trying to make this somewhat parallel to it. And then do you see this angle on the building here? And so I was trying to make this parallel to it. Then I'd have to fine tune these sides to be sure I have them just right. When I'm done, I hit return or enter. And if I were to choose undo, I've made two changes because I went in there twice. I'll show you here what it looked like. I think that was the original, and now I've kind of repositioned it and also warped it in a way that changed the perspective slightly. So the thing about this is we can define as many of those surfaces as we need to, but this only works good with rectangular boxes. So if you have something that has a curved edge, then we don't have the tools to define a curve, and it doesn't know how to distort that curve. So if you look at something like a building, like this building here, we could use it right on it. If I were to go here and convert it to a smart filter, choose edit, perspective warp, I could come in and define, and I'm not going to do it precisely here because just for time's sake, but I could do this. And then define another side. Like this, and get this to be parallel with everything that's there. But it's going to have difficulties in some spots. Like in this section here, do I define it as this flat surface there, or do I define it as a surface going the other direction? You know, those kinds of things. It's going to be limited in how it can deal with this stuff. And if there's ever any curves or just openings in those surfaces, it won't be as readily, useful. But I could do things like this, and then if I wished, I would have shot this in a different way. I'll go to our next feature. I can tell it to make like all the verticals, take all the near vertical lines and actually make them vertical. So if I had tilted up or down in the building, it would suddenly snap those verticals. This either won't work or will look really weird. I'm going to tell it to snap the horizontals to make them perfectly horizontal. You see how it tried to straighten out the building? Or I can tell it to do both. And so that could be somewhat interesting to try to take something that was three-dimensional and flatten it out, but it's looking a little odd here. I'll choose the undo. Most of the time, just doing the verticals could be useful. And then if I wish this would have looked a little differently, I could go over here and say, well, let's get that perspective to be different, which is really interesting to be able to do it. But it does have limited use, though, because they're just rectangles. All right, let's try other ways of bending and changing perspective and doing all that. So I believe we worked with this image on one of the other days, but I did something without describing how to be good at it, which is I warped a picture so it bent around this mug, if my memory is correct. And I'd like to do that again, but this time I want to show you how to be precise about it and how to make it the most versatile. So I'll go to Bridge, and I'm going to drag the corner of Bridge over so I can still see my picture. And I'm just going to choose a photograph to put onto the mug. I'll choose this one, drag it over, and let go. When you drag and drop, this happens to be a RAW file, so it brings me to Camera Raw. But if I click OK, when you drag and drop, it'll automatically start to bring you into the transformation screen. So I'll bring that down until this is big enough where I'm just looking at the width and not looking at the bending. So right now it goes beyond the edge of the mug, so I'll bring it down until it would fit within the mug and get it positioned somewhere near where it should go. I'll press Return or Enter. Then we'll zoom up, and let's see how we can get this to bend and somewhat conform to our mug. I think it might be easiest if I move the image so it's near the top edge of the mug, and just that way I can see how closely the top edge matches the curvature up here. And then later on, after I get curved, I can just move the image down. But that way at least I know it matches the curvature. That's not essential, but it's useful to have. And what we'll do is, this is already a smart object because when I dragged it from Bridge over, it automatically converts it into a smart object. Had I copied and pasted or gotten it over here in any other way that didn't turn it into a smart object, I would convert it first. Then I'll go to the Edit menu and I find the choice called Puppet Warp. Puppet Warp is actually not what I'm going to use here. We have many different kinds of warping. We have puppet warping, we have perspective warping. We want to just choose plain old warping. Isn't that interesting? Plain old warping is where we're just going to get handles on the corners of a rectangle and be able to move them. If normal warping is not enough, that's when we head into the other more specified or specific kinds of warping. So let's do warp. When I do that, I have a grid, and right now there are handles on the four corners of my image. It might look like there's more than four handles, but there aren't. There are handles, or how should I say it? There are points on the four corners, and coming out of them are these little handles. Those might look like points that are attached to the picture, but they're not. Those are connected to the little corner points, just so you know. So the only thing that matters right now as far as what I'm moving are the corner points. So I'm going to move this corner straight up until it matches the edge of the mug. Then I'm going to move the opposite corner straight up until it matches the edge of the mug. Then these handles determine what angle is the edge of the picture going to be bent to the moment it leaves this point. Is it going to go, for instance, upward like that? Is it going to go downward like that? Should it go way over this way to begin with? You know, what should it do? And so if you look at the mug itself, right where that point is, the first direction it should move in is kind of this way, isn't it? So that's the direction I want to get this handle, is so it's pointing at the direction the image should move in the moment it leaves that point. Doesn't matter if it needs to deviate quite quickly after that, it's just right when it leaves. What direction should it start moving in? And so I'm guessing about that direction, looking at the edge of the mug. Then over here, I need it to leave at a little bit more steep of an angle. So if I had this go up, you see how the picture would go up first, or go way over here first. Now I want it, if you look at the edge of the mug, to go about maybe around that angle is my guess. Then to control what happens between those two corners, I'm going to grab not these handles, but the edge of the picture itself. When I grab the edge of the picture, do you see how I can move it? And that's changing both the angle and the distance of those handles to control this. I just wanted to get them close to begin with. And now I'm going to be pulling that around until I'll pretty much move my mouse up to the edge of the mug, and then I'll kind of trace it back and forth, and somewhere in that I should end up with where I'm really close to having it match. If it still doesn't match, it means I got these angles off a little bit. And it could be I need this one the littlest bit higher, and then I'll come back and try again. Say that's starting to look relatively good. Now for the bottom edge of the mug, I can't move this down at the moment. I could press Return or Enter to say I'm done, which I'll do, and then move it down with the Move tool to get it near the bottom of the mug, if I find that to be helpful, and then go back into warp again, as if I never left. But I can't move it while I'm in warping, at least not that I can think of off the top of my head. So now if I want to get the bottom edge, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll pull out these little handles, and I'm just thinking about what angle should it be leaving at the moment it leaves this point. And right now it's going straight to the right. I need it to go more like that. I'll do the same thing on the other side. Then I'll drag the middle to control what's happening in between. Sometimes when you try to grab the edge, it just won't let you. You're just a teeniest bit off. It needs you to be relatively precise. I'll pull it up just so I can see where the edge is, and then I'll pull it back down to see if I can get it somewhat close. Now, if I wanted to move it back up, you might think you could just click on it to move it, but you can't. Watch what happens. If I click in the middle, So if I want to move it, I press Return or Enter to say I'm done. I use my Move tool to move it back up. So now I have it centered on my mug, and then I can go back in here to warp if I need to fine tune it again. You get the idea that you can use Move tool to move it. So now I'm just going to fine tune the center. And if you grab it, you can see how you can move it way over like this, many different ways. What I'm mainly doing is trying to get the lines of the grid. I'm ignoring the picture because it doesn't have enough structure to it to make it obvious where it would be off. So I'm trying to get the lines within that grid to be as close to precise as I can. When I'm done, I'll press Return or Enter. And then to make it look as if this is actually printed on the mug, because right now it just looks like it's obscuring your view of the mug, I'm going to change the blending mode at the top of my Layers panel to a choice called Multiply. Multiply acts like ink, so it's going to print this on top of the mug. It will only darken the mug, and I can get something like this. If that's too dark, I can either adjust the photograph, or I could type Command J to duplicate the photograph, and I could experiment with other blending modes. If you want to cycle through the blending modes, you can be in the Move tool, and if you hold down the Shift key and use the arrows, I'm going to say not the arrows, the plus or minus keys on your keyboard, you could cycle through them. And so I might come in here and try some other modes, but in essence, this image I hadn't optimized before I put it in there. So I'm going to throw away that copy, and I'm just going to double click on the thumbnail for this layer. I don't know if you remember or not, but it was a raw file. And let's think about optimizing it. I might make it just a little bit brighter than usual. Click OK. I happen to have a what's called a snapshot built in there, which allowed me to load in some settings I already had. But you can see how I've changed the look of the image. And I can optimize it as much as I want. Now, this still doesn't look like it's precisely aligned. I think this edge here is a little bit too low when I look at this, but that's great. I can go over here at any time and choose warp once again and just pull that side up if it needs to be the littlest bit higher and adjust its shape if need be. It's really nice because it's a smart object that it's never permanent. If I look at this angle here, it seems to be off from the vertical of the edge of the mug. Just head back in. Warp, it's not permanent. So I now try to get that so these sides are parallel. You know what would be best? It would be best if I didn't use a picture at all when I do this. Instead, what I could have done is I could have used a picture of a grid. If I use a picture of a grid, and that's what I'm bending, it's much easier to tell when it's distorted. So if you want to know how to create a grid like this, what I'd suggest you do is the following. I would open a picture of the size that you would like to use. So if it's a RAW file, figure out what size RAW file it is, or if it's a JPEG, whatever it is, just open it. Once you have it open, fill the document. Just go up to the Edit menu. You can choose Fill. One of your choices is to fill with white. So you have a document of the same size as the picture you plan to use. To make a grid relatively quickly, you can go to the View menu, and there's a choice in here. I think it's under View. Take me just a second. It's called New Guide Layout. New Guide Layout. New Guide Layout allows you to create a layout of guides. And so I'm going to come in here, and with the checkbox called Columns turned on, I can decide how many divisions do I want across the horizontal. Then I can turn on a checkbox called Rows, and I'm just going to bring that number up until they look like they're close to square. About there, you think? Somewhere in there. They don't have to be perfectly square, but as long as they're close. Then I want the grid to also be around the edge of the picture. And I notice in here, it's got a setting known as the gutter. The gutter is the gap in between the double guides at each intersection. And at the bottom, I can turn on a setting called margin. And if I do, I just want to make sure the same number is typed in. And right when I turned on margin, it typed in that for me. So that now if you look around the edge of the document, you'll see an extra guide on each side. So anyway, we got all that. I'm going to click OK. Now, if I were to use my selection tools, selections will snap to those grid lines. So if I hold Shift to add to my selection, I can come in here and relatively quickly select all these areas. And then once I'm done, I will fill them with black. If I fill them with black, I should have a nice grid in here. Now, there are many other ways of creating grids, and I only use this way because I find next to nobody realizes that that feature is in there, the one that will create these guides. And it can be rather useful. I'm holding Shift the whole time here, and that is making it so each time I click my mouse, it's adding to the selection that's already existing on screen, and therefore I can get all these to add together. I could also instead use there's a line tool. It's part of the shape tool. And I could set it to the same width as these guides and just draw these out if I wanted to. But I'm having fun making a selection like this. Because how often do you get to snap to this many guides? Once I have all these defined, I will need to get the bottom edge because I don't have that yet. And what's nice is if you use the same size image a lot of the time, and if you shoot with the same camera, you probably have the same size image for everything, then you only need to create this once. You can just save this set of grids and use it any time you want. It's not like you have to create it every time. Now I can choose Edit, Fill, and I'm going to fill with black. I can then go to the View menu, and there's a choice called Clear Guides. And now I have a nice grid. I can save that grid. And now that's what I would use to bend around the mug when I'm first doing it. And therefore, it's much easier to tell how is the entire thing being distorted. But you might be thinking, I don't want an end result that looks like a grid on a mug. Well, as long as whatever it is you bent on that mug is the same size as the actual picture you wanted on the mug, and you turned it into a smart object before you did the bending, then all you need to do is go up here to the Layer menu, choose Smart Objects, and there's a choice called Replace Contents. And if I choose Replace Contents, then I can attempt to find the image I'd like to use, double-click on it, and of course, it's a raw file. It'll come up in Camera Raw. Let's adjust this one first. There. I had a preset built in that had an adjustment. I'll click OK, and as long as they're the same size, it should bend. And if I wanted to fine-tune it, I could do the same thing. I could come in here and say Layer, Smart Objects, Replace Contents, and there's my spiffy little grid I made. And you can see how the center needs some more adjustment, but you see how it'd be much easier to figure out when you're in this. And therefore, when you're fine-tuning it, you could warp. You can grab the grid lines that are here, kind of pull on them to attempt to get them out, up and down, however you'd like, until you think you have the distortion compensated for. Then replace contents. That's all you need. Okay? So what's nice about that is you could create a bunch of templates. Let's say that you typically shoot high school sports. And for high school sports, you have a bunch of products you sell. You sell sports teams on a coffee mug. You sell them on a, I don't know what other products, a Frisbee or something, whatever it is, and you just pre-make all of the templates using the grid. So you have it all set up, and then anytime you want to show a particular team what their stuff would look like, all you're doing is saying replace contents, and you're filling them with the pictures you've taken. And so you do the work once, and then you can use it over and over and over again. So it can be nice. Might as well save this just in case we need it. And the class, of course, you get a little mug picture to practice on. And then if you want some homework, you got a book where you can bend your picture so that it fits on the page. But why not take your own book so you get some really interesting looking ones with maybe with a really thick number of pages where it really bends a lot. Take a picture of it. And then all you got to do is replace the pages in the book. And you can bend your photo for that. The thing you would need to do afterwards if you completely replace the pages is if there was already printing on the pages, then we can't use multiply mode to just say make it look like it's printed, because then it would be the ink that's already on the sheet of paper with our picture printed on top of it. And so you either want to start with pages that are white, or afterwards you're going to have to add a little highlight and shadow in here. You can do that by painting with the paintbrushes at low opacity on top of your image. But you see that little highlight going across the page? We'd need to replicate that. Now let's look at yet another way of bending and distorting our images. In this case, I have a picture of my wife, Karen. And I take pictures of Karen doing yoga all over the world in really unique locations. We've done them on, I don't know, I've probably done them on 5 different continents so far. If you want to see them, get on Instagram and search for "The World Is My Yoga Mat." Just all one word. That's our username on Instagram. And this is one that I shot last time I was in San Francisco with Karen. And usually when I'm taking these photographs, I'm yelling over to Karen to correct her posture. Move your left arm higher. Move your right arm, you know. But sometimes she can't hear me. There's traffic or something else. And let's see how can I correct her posture after the fact. Now, the first thing I would need to do in this case is we're going to use a feature that we used in our advanced retouching lesson. If you happen to remember that lesson, I had some fabric that was striped. There were some baskets hanging on top of it. I retouched out one of the baskets by moving and doing what's called puppet warping. But in the process of doing that, I didn't show you how the same feature would be used if you need to do something like correct posture. So let's see what we can do. The first thing I want to do is get Karen onto her own layer. And I want to fill the layer that's underneath so she's no longer on that layer. Therefore, we have clean background, so if I move Karen's arm up or down, there's something behind it to take over that spot where her arm used to be. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to cheat because we're not talking about making selections. I'm going to go to the Select menu and choose Load Selection, and I hope I saved one in here. If I didn't save one in here, then I'll have to do it, but I did. I have a selection called Karen. That won't magically be in your files when you work on your own photographs, but if you happen to work on this photograph, it will be to save you a little bit of time. All I did was I used the Quick Selection tool to select Karen. I went into Quick Mask mode. I had to touch up where the highlights were on the top edges of her arms because it didn't quite select that correctly, so I painted. And then I went into the feature that is currently known as Select and Mask. It used to be called Refine Edge. And I painted just where Karen's hair was, because that's where we had furry, fuzzy, or hairy stuff. And that's how this selection was created. But that description takes up a lot less time than actually doing the work. So this way we can concentrate on what needs to be done. Now, I'm going to turn this into a smart object. So I want to take just the area where Karen is and do it. So I'm going to type Command J, Control J in Windows, which means jump to a new layer. Watch my layers panel. Command J. You see Karen up there? Then I'll turn this into a smart object so that if I do any bending, it's not permanent. But then I'm going to hide that layer and I'm going to work on what's underneath. Because right now, if I took the top layer and I moved her arms, you would see her old arms underneath on the layer below. I need to do something that makes it so the background is kind of clean, so I have space to move things around without seeing like two arms. If you want to see what I'm talking about, it's just like if I move Karen right now. Do you see how there's another one right underneath? So that's going to happen. I'll hide that top layer, work on what's underneath, and I'm going to come in here and just try to get rid of Karen. It doesn't have to be the best job in the world. I can always touch it up later, but right now I am using the spot healing brush. And I'm going to just try, probably would have been a little faster now that I think about it, to just load the selection that I had a second ago. And if you load that selection, you could go up to the Select menu, you could choose Modify, and there was a choice called Expand, which means make my selection larger. And then I could try using the feature that was called Content Aware Fill. I don't know if you remember that or not, but that's where you go to the Edit menu, you choose Fill, and you set it to Content Aware. That might have been a lot faster than this. Oh, and right there I didn't paint far enough beyond her face. So just a few little touch-up spots. I'm not going to make this perfect because I don't know which areas are going to be visible out of this background, but I will just do the blatant parts. If it doesn't want to do what I want there, I'll switch to the healing brush to force it to copy from where I want it to. So I'll option click right here. And maybe about there. For now, I'm going to say close enough because I want to wait until I'm done moving Karen's arms to see what parts are actually going to be visible. Don't want to spend too much time touching up something that Karen's going to be covering up. Now I'm going to switch to the layer that's on top. I'll turn its eyeball back on. So now we have a relatively clean background to work with, and we have Karen. Next, I will go to the Edit menu and choose Puppet Warp. Now with Puppet Warp, it's going to start by putting a grid on top of my image, and I can turn off that grid by clicking on this icon up here. Now, in certain versions of Photoshop, if you have a larger screen, it might not look like this icon. It might be text that says something like Show Mesh. I think that might be what it says. And if you turn that off, you wouldn't see it. I find the mesh not to be that useful to look at. And at this point, I could go on top of my image and click. And if I click, I see a point. If I drag that point, you'll see how, in this case, it's moving the entire image because nothing else within the image has been held down, held in place. So I'm going to first add some points. I'm going to add one on the base of both feet to say keep these right where they are. Now if I go back to the point I was trying to move earlier, we have two that are stuck, which is where her feet are, right? So they're staying in position, and I can now move this. I'll choose undo. There's certain parts I didn't want to move, though. I'm going to click where her joints would be. I'm going to click right there where her knee would be. I'll click right here where her hip would be. Maybe another one over here for her other hip. And let's just see what I can do. I could try to say, well, maybe I was supposed to put her in a completely different pose. Maybe she was supposed to be doing this. Put one right in her shoulder to try to control that separate. Right in her shoulder, control it separate. So you think Karen does all these yoga poses all over the world? Hell no. She's just doing one pose, and I do this. No, Karen will be going, what? Like she does the handbook for this. No, Karen does all the poses. I've never done this to one of Karen's poses, ever. But here, I shouldn't have added this right in the middle of her arm there. Ideally, I should move it, I should put it where her joints are, because that's where things could like pivot around. And so I'm going to click on that particular point, hit delete, which will put it back, but I'm going to do it right here. And then I might move it up. And then I could put another one right there if I needed to fine tune. But you see how you can easily go, whoa, whoa, she's breakdancing now, you know. You do have to be careful. It's you know, it can look really nice to begin with, but so you get the idea that I could do a little bit of correction with this. Be careful though, you can also extend, and so you do have to visualize what would be appropriate and what's the limits of how far I can move things. But if her knee, you know, this front leg, I would usually say, Karen, move your knee forward a little to get your leg perfectly vertical in the front. And if she didn't do that, I could either pull this a little bit, but her leg's going to start looking too long, or I could pull this that way. And then if I need her toe to come back up, I click where the toe is. So wherever I'm putting these points is where I can pivot things around. And so you want to put these points in not just where you want to move stuff, but also where you want to anchor things to prevent them from moving. And so oftentimes I'll put these in even though I have no plans on changing these, because I just don't want some areas to be shifting around kind of randomly with that. But this is known as puppet warping. Yep. And it can be helpful for all sorts of things. We used it the other day with retouching. I had some fabric that had stripes in it. And I moved that chunk of fabric somewhere else to an area that had wrinkles and, you know, things in the fabric. And so I'm like, fine, I need to create those wrinkles somehow. So puppet warping is what I went to do it. We have all sorts of options as to how to bend and warp things. This is just one of them. Okay? But I put her on her own layer, and that was so that when I moved her, I didn't see her old arms still sitting behind there. Otherwise, I'd have two sets of arms, right? The original ones, that would be on the layer below, and then these. Now at this point, if that's what I actually wanted, I would zoom up and I'd start being critical of the background. And I would start thinking, where do I still need to touch up the background? There's a chance that right here, I think that might be like this cable coming up here, and it just looks like it's broken off there. So I'd need to think, where would that cable come down, and do I need to retouch that up? And just be critical of what's back there. Are there any repeated shapes like these that shouldn't be there or not? And if so, consider fixing them. Okay? But if you isolate the object first, so that's all you have in the layer, and turn it into a smart object first, then whenever you come back here and choose Puppet Warp, then the dots will still be in those positions. You can fine-tune them as much as you'd like. If it's not a smart object, though, then when you go back to do Puppet Warp a second time, there'd be no dots on there. You'd have to start over as far as adding them. We having fun yet? Oh, we're nowhere near enough fun. So, of course, I'll open a picture of me. I'm going to turn this into a smart object so that whatever I do is not permanent. And this time, we're going to come in and use Liquify. Liquify is a filter. You'll find it under the filter menu. And if you don't have the same version of Photoshop that I have, which was just introduced a couple days ago, therefore a lot of you might not have updated your Photoshop yet, and therefore you might not have this version, then there'll be some features in here that aren't available to you, because one of the new features in the new version is in here. We'll get to it in a few minutes. And that's why when I first come in here, I see some white lines that are kind of indicating, look, there's a face here. And do you see those kind of bent lines on the left and the right? We'll get to those. And if I happen to move over, why don't we get to those now? Because they look pretty interesting. It looks like it's doing a bunch of stuff. Well, if you happen to have a face in your picture and it's prominent, then Photoshop hopefully will find it. If your face is tilted a lot, I find that it sometimes can't find it. If it's like somebody's got their head at a 45-degree angle, it might not get it. But if their head is relatively straight onto the camera, then it should be able to find it. And then watch what happens if I move my mouse in here. I'm going to first move it into this area where I see this outer ring. If I pull on the top, I could imagine I didn't have a hat on. This would control how big my forehead is. So I want my forehead to be more prominent or not. If I pulled here, you see the width of my head is changing. But when it does, look at my eyes. They're staying in the same spot. So I can come in there a little bit. I can come down here to the bottom and pull, and this is going to control how tall my chin is. This is controlling my cheeks, my jawline. Do I want it to be prominent or do I want to pull it in? If I come up to my mouth, I can control my upper lip, although sometimes it's hard to grab. There. See how it's getting smaller or bigger? I can control my upper lip or my lower lip. Maybe my lower lip's too big, so I bring it in. And I can even go over here and control the width, and then wait for it, go out to this little outer edge in my smile. Now, I'll do this to a greater extent than you probably should, just to make it more obvious what's happening. But if you're doing really subtle changes to this, making somebody's nose the tiniest bit smaller, making their eyes the tiniest bit bigger, that kind of stuff, it can be a fine thing to use. I just want to show you how it's done. Here, I'll zoom up a little bit so you can see it better. When I mouse over my nose, you'll see that there are 3 dots. If I grab the bottom one, I'm going to control how long my nose is. And so I'll make my nose a little longer. Then if I grab one of these outer ones, I'll control the width of the nose. If I come up to the eyes, we have some choices. And one of them controls how large the eyes are. Another one controls how large they are in a different dimension. And then one of these, it might be the one out here, controls the tilt. I wish it had controls for that individually for each eye, but to the best of my knowledge, it does both at the same time. Because sometimes, one person's eye is just a little bit more closed and smaller, and so it'd be nice if I can control them separate, but it doesn't seem to have that built in. Now, what I'm doing the whole time I'm grabbing these various areas is I'm actually working with settings that are found over here. There's an area called Face Aware Liquify, and that's the new feature in this newly announced version of Photoshop. If I open it up, if there was more than one face in my image, here there's a pop-up menu where I'd be able to switch between various faces. So it can be nice when you're in a group shot and somebody their face looks a little bit on the odd side because they just didn't get the best expression at the moment it was done. Here it might recognize every person in a group shot, and then just that 1 or 2 people in there that are looking just a little bit off. You come in and say, well, that one with the eyes were squinting a little, let's get their eyes opened up a little bit, that kind of stuff. And all the things that I was doing by pulling on the image can be done by moving these sliders. So there's the overall size of the eye, and then there's the eye height and width, the tilt, and oh, I didn't show you this, the distance between the eyes. Ooh, geez. Then if I could get the eyeball direction, I could just make myself cross-eyed. But again, subtle changes, usually small amounts so that they're not so noticeable. Here I'm doing a whole bunch of them that wouldn't be necessary. And with the nose, we can do both the width and the height. With the mouth, we get the smile amount, upper lip, lower lip, the width and height, all that kind of stuff. But the main thing that's nice about this is that it's automatically detecting where these areas are. So it simply saves you time. None of those things are things we couldn't have done in the past. It's just that we would have to choose the appropriate tool in here in order to accomplish it. So because of that, why don't we, I'm going to reset this. There's just a reset button over here. Why don't we talk about the tools that are over here and see what they do. So first, the top tool is going to push things around. So if I were to click on my eye and do this, I'm going to be, imagine it's made out of, do you remember Silly Putty? Where you could take Silly Putty and push it on a newspaper and transfer what's on the newspaper, then you could pull it. Not everybody in the world will know what Silly Putty is, but imagine you printed your image on some pliable stuff that you could pull on. This is similar. It's very easy to get way overdone with it, but it's really useful when you have like fabric that is just kind of sticking out on somebody's arm or something. It doesn't quite look right. I can come in here and just kind of try to push that down a little bit if I get a smaller brush so I only affect that area. See how now that looks a little more like what should be there. Over here, I think I have another little bump, so I'll get a brush approximately the width of that. Touch that up. Just know here it looks fine with that sky, but it is pushing the background as well. So there is a tool that allows you to undo what you've done and to lessen it. Let me first move some things around here. I'll pull in my earlobe thing to try to make it as if that was a problem with my anatomy. Don't worry, I'm not self-conscious. I'm not going, my ears. My dad's ears, though, they were huge. Like. Then the next tool down, this one, allows you to reconstruct areas, meaning that if you went too far with something, you could take that particular tool and say, I didn't mean to do that to the ear, somehow I want to get back. So I use this tool and watch when I paint across the ear. Do you see it coming back to the way it used to be? And what's nice is if you just did I'll choose undo, if you just did a teeny bit too far, then you want to undo. On the right side of your screen, there is a choice here called density. And if I were to bring that down, I believe if I brought that down, it'd take me a lot longer to get it back to normal. So therefore, I could just do very subtle changes. Say, just bring that back a tiny bit. And this is also could be used if parts of the background got distorted. Let's say this was a bathroom tile behind here, so the grout lines need to be perfectly straight, and now they've been pushed. I could try to paint on the background to get the distortion on the background to disappear, to stop it. The only thing is if I paint too close and I got to the part where the image had my shoulder there, suddenly my shoulder would start coming back to the way it used to be. Let's go down a little bit to this tool. This one here is going to rotate things. And if I first click here, watch what happens. You see it rotating? The longer you hold it, the more it rotates. And on the right side, if you lower the settings that are there, you can make it so it takes longer for it to make a change. So therefore, you can make much more subtle changes where you have to hold quite a long time before you see a big change. But that's one of the things it might be doing while it's thinking about making me smile, is just rotating a little bit. This rotates it clockwise, and that wouldn't be the right setting for over here. So if you hold down the Option key, I believe it is, Option means do the opposite in this case. So now if I don't have Option held down, you see the direction it's rotating? If I hold Option down, though, it goes the other way. So the combination of rotating a little bit and grabbing the tool that pushes things around could be used to come in here and manipulate a smile but you're going to be subtle in your manipulation, a lot more subtle than I'm doing here, in order to make it look realistic. But that's what that tool does, is it rotates things clockwise. If you hover over it, it'll tell you with the tooltip. It says twirl clockwise. That's the name. And if you hold Option, you get counterclockwise. The next tool down is called the pucker tool. It's supposed to make people pucker. Let's see what it does. If I do it on my eye, you see how it makes things smaller? Choose undo, and it might be my cheeks are a little too puffy. So I could try to take part of my cheek and just bring it in a little bit. Maybe my whole jaw is a little bit much. Oftentimes, that's what I do is I just click and let go to just do really brief changes that might build up. Maybe the tip of my nose is a little larger than I want it to be, so I just do the tiniest. Like that. Now, if I hold down Option, you might be able to guess what it would do. Instead of pinching in and puckering things, it's going to bloat things. So let's see if I hold Options. Can you see my eye getting bigger? I can do that kind of stuff. So that always gives you the opposite. And in fact, the next tool down is called the bloat tool, and it just does that to begin with. It's the opposite of the pucker tool. Makes things bigger, and if you hold Option, it will make things smaller. Just remember, if you mess up and create something that's a little scary like I have, you always have the reconstruct tool. Reconstruct means bring me closer to the original. So if I did a little too much, I just click and let go briefly. And if I click and hold, I will eventually get all the way back. And you're like, that's how weird my eyes usually look? But we can do that. Now, other things. We have another tool called the push left tool. Push left tool. Watch what happens if I drag up using this tool. See how it's pushing left? It just pushed the image. So if I happen to do that on the side of my nose, like right here, I could push it left. And if you lower the settings on the right side of your screen for density and rate, you can make it so it's not as aggressive with its pushing. Now, if I want it to push the opposite direction, what I do is I actually don't hold on Option usually. I just drag the opposite direction. I was dragging up. Now I'm going to drag down. Do you see it? Can you notice it push the other way? I'll reconstruct my eye because I didn't want it to look weird. There, I reconstructed my eye. But that's going to push. It depends on if you're dragging up or down, what direction it's going to push. And so usually you have to experiment first to remember what direction it's going to push, and then you'll get an idea. What I might do is push my nose like that, and then just come back to the reconstruct tool. And if I lower its density setting and possibly its rate setting, I could come in here and just bring it somewhat back. Meaning I didn't want it that extreme, but I might start extreme and just kind of bring back parts of it with the reconstruct tool. So it doesn't look as extreme of a change. Then below that we have two icons related to masking. And in the case of masking, it means that let's prevent areas from changing. Let's say that I really liked the look of my nose and mouth at the moment. And I'm going to be making other changes to the image, and I don't want the nose and mouth to change because they look great. So I'm going to take the freeze tool, I believe that's its name, and I'm going to paint on top of the areas that I don't want to change. And by painting over them, these will literally be frozen where they cannot move. Then any other tool that I use simply cannot affect that part of the image. So maybe I come in there and freeze this. And oftentimes what this will be is a background. You'll be trying to slim somebody or do something like that. You'll have a background you're worried about getting distorted because you want to use a big brush so you can work on a large area of something, somebody's leg or whatever it happens to be. And you're going to start outside of that person and just slowly move in towards them. But you know your brush is going to be 90% on the background when you do it. So you freeze the background first. You just paint with red over all the background you don't want to change, then you can move in there. And you know you're only going to start affecting it in those areas. So in this case, I'll use reconstruct. I'll try to get my eye back to normal. And I know that if I paint over the nose, it's not going to bring the nose back. Like maybe I want to bring my cheeks a little bit further back and other things, but that freezes them. Then there is another icon down below, which is known as the thaw tool or thaw mask tool, and that simply removes the red stuff, which means, let me change this area now. So red is a frozen area, whereas this thaws the mask. There are options for it on the right side of my screen. There's an area here called Mask Options. There's a button called None, which would clear off all the red stuff. So if I'm done working, after freezing something, I can hit None. I can also say Mask All, because then I might take the tool it takes away from the mask to say this is the only part of the image I currently want to be able to change. So now everything else is frozen. There's also a button called Invert All, which will give you the opposite. So I just worked the eye, now I want to do the stuff around it. So we have all that. There are a bunch of icons up here. I rarely use these, but if you were to click on them, you have the choice of if you had a selection active before you came in here, do you want it to freeze the area that was selected? Or if your layer was like the one of Karen, where she's doing her yoga, remember how it was on its own layer and it was empty around her? Then if I set it to transparency, it would freeze the checkerboard, the empty parts. Or if I had a layer mask attached to the layer, I could tell it to use that. And actually, if you choose selection, I think it will also allow you to use saved selections. Like if you had any saved selections, it'll give you a list. So anyway, you can get fancy with that if you'd like. Then if you continue down the tools, the next tool down is a tool you won't find in every version of Photoshop. It's supposed to look like a face or face and shoulders, and that's what I click on when I want to get in where I had all those little overlays as I move my mouse over the various areas of my picture, and I could fine-tune the proportions of my face. If you find that those aren't visible, either you don't have the newest version of Photoshop, the one that was just announced, or that icon's not turned on. You're in one of the other tools. Then there are a few other options down here. Here we can show our image, which if we turn off, you won't see your image. You might be thinking, why would you ever not want to see your image? That's because as an alternative, you could see the mesh that describes the distortion being done, where it's distorting this grid instead, and therefore you can tell where the distortion is. That's really helpful when you're done and you want to see, is any part of the background still being distorted or not? And so you turn on the mesh, and you can put both the mesh and the image on at the same time so you can see, and therefore you might give you an idea of what parts do you need to clean up. Where did you not realize you had distortion that shouldn't have been there? And when you have Show Mesh turned on, down here you can choose how big of a mesh and what color it is, just so it separates from your image. And when you're using the freeze feature, there is a choice down here for what color that overlay is. Remember when I painted it was red? Well, if you're working on a red fire truck, it's going to be hard to see red, so you can change it. If you happen to be working on an image more like the image of Karen that I had, where you isolated her on her own layer, and it was mainly full of transparency around her, and the background you saw was on a different layer, usually here you'd only see the one layer you're working on, but here you can choose Show Backdrop, and if you choose Show Backdrop, you can say, show me all the layers that were in my image, that kind of stuff to see what it looks like with the rest of the image. In this case, though, that's not going to be helpful. And then finally, if you completely screw up, we have a Restore All button, which is going to bring my image back to its original state when you're in here. So Liquify can be overused, but it can also be extremely helpful. The main thing is to let the novelty wear off, meaning practice enough where you're showing doing funny stuff, and then start learning how subtle you can be with it. And really watch out for backgrounds that have been distorted that you just might not have been thinking about, but other people will notice. If you go on Photoshop or you go on the web and search for Photoshop fails, you will find so many images where you'll find people have been nipping and tucking body parts, and that backgrounds are so obviously manipulated that it's ridiculous. And they'll tell you what publications they were published in. And you're like, really? For that publication, they were that bad? And part of it is they never turned on their mesh to see where is that distortion within the image, so they see, is the background distorted? And then it just tells you if there's a bunch of distortion covering the background, you might want to inspect that part before you're done. So when you're done, you can click OK. And if you were working with a smart object, the changes you just made were not permanent. If you go right back into Liquify, it's as if you never left. So you can continue to refine it, which is real nice. So that if you notice that background that got distorted only after you make a print, you can come back in and fix it very easily. All right. We're going to now look at another way of bending things. I want it to look as if this flag is bent, as if it's almost flapping in the wind. In fact, I'll show you an end result that I did. I think I have it, yeah, right here. So this was a graphic very similar to this one that had no lighting, that had no dimension to it whatsoever, and I was able to do the following. See how it's flapping in the wind, and notice that it has highlights and shadows on it to define it. And so I want to show you the general technique that was used for this, and then it was just used over and over again to make multiple frames for this animation. So I'll stop that. So what I have in this particular document is one layer per position of the flag. So if I turn on the other layers, you'll see the other positions. In fact, I should probably start at the bottom. You see them right now, one on top of the other now, but I was just switching which version of the flag was visible. And we're going to talk about the feature that was used to actually bend the flag. Before the flag was bent, it looked like that, with no shading at all. And let me show you what bent the flag. Do you see this grayscale picture? That caused the flag to bend. Now, we're going to make a grayscale picture just like this one, and we're going to have it bend the flag. But let's look at, or just think about how is it thinking about this? Why is this useful, this grayscale thing? Well, we're going to have a grayscale image where Photoshop is going to interpret it where any area that is 50% gray will be considered an area that does not move the flag at all. The flag remains where it was. Then any area that is, if I get this right, brighter than 50% gray is where it's going to move the flag closer to us. Any area that's darker than 50% gray will move it further away from us. So here, do you see how I have white? That's where the flag would be very close to us. Then that white fades out here. That's like the flag getting further away from us until it hits 50% gray, where it's where the flag used to be. Then it starts getting darker as it goes over here. Darker means further away. So now it's going further away than it originally was, and it gets as far away as it can right about here. And then it starts getting brighter as you go this way. Brighter means getting a little closer to us, and it keeps doing that until it gets all the way up to white. When it comes to the animation, I had to get fancy and create more than one of these. If you watch, I can show you what they look like. All it is I moved those to the right, like this. And I did need to get fancy one other way, and that was when I did this, you'll notice that the flag looks like it's attached to the flagpole. It's got some extra layers in there, so it's messing up right now. But do you notice that it looks like the flag is attached right here and right there? That was accomplished In each one of these, do you notice 2 dots of 50% gray right there? 50% gray means don't move. And so do you see consistently in the same position, there are 2 dots of 50% gray, and that meant keep the flag stationary right here, which is where I want it to be attached. So you know more information than you need to know for this technique for most purposes, but hopefully it gives you some sense for there's 50% gray means don't move. Darker than 50% gray means move further from me. Lighter than 50% gray means move closer. So then after that, we're going to have to figure out how to get the highlights and the shadows. And so we're going to do it with this. I'm not going to make the animation. That's just spending more time doing it. But what I will do here is I'm going to change the name of the background layer. And I'm going to most likely turn this into, let's see, I think I can do it with a smart filter. And let's scale this down. I just type Command-T so that we have some room for it to flap, because otherwise it'll be getting cropped off as it flaps. That. Move it up. And I'm just going to put something in here to replace the checkerboard. I'll go to the bottom of my Layers panel, click on the Adjustment Layer icon, and choose Solid Color. And why don't we just put it on black? I'll put the black underneath in my Layers panel. And just to simplify the look in the Layers panel, I don't need the mask. The mask would allow me to limit where the black shows up, but I want it to fill the screen. So just to simplify the look, I'll drag the mask to the trash. Okay, so we just have a simple flag, which is a smart object, with the black beneath it. Next, we're going to create a grayscale picture that's going to tell it how to bend the flag. To accomplish that, I'll create a new layer. I'll grab my paintbrush tool, and I'm just going to get a huge soft edge brush. And I'm going to paint with black like this. I just painted like a V shape. Then I'm going to switch and paint with white, and I'm going to draw a V shape. Just so the flag isn't perfectly straight the way it bends, instead it's kind of ruffled. And I'll draw another white one here. So if I hide the other layers, this is what I have on the top layer. Now, I want some areas to be 50% gray, because that means where shouldn't it move things? I can't have the empty part. I need something in there. We're going to use a weird feature in Photoshop to get 50% gray in there. I'll go to the Edit menu and choose Fill. And when you fill something, one of the choices you have for what to fill with is 50% gray. But right now, since there's no selection active, it would fill the entire layer. It would get rid of all this and just fill the whole layer with gray. But check this out. Do you remember blending modes? Well, there are 2 blending modes in here that aren't found elsewhere. And they are behind and clear. Behind means act as if I'm putting this behind this layer, on a separate layer, but don't do it on a separate layer. Do it within this one, meaning fill only the empty parts. So when I say fill with 50% gray, but do it behind what's already in this layer, it just filled the empty parts. So that's kind of a cool setting. All right, now hopefully that'll be what we want for our bending. So let's think about it. In fact, I probably should have had some 50% gray areas in there. Maybe I'll come in with my brush and just create some. I'll just make this a little smaller. That a little smaller. I was just painting with 50% gray. So this is going to mean here, don't move my flag. Then this is going to say move it close to me. This is going to say move it far away. This is move close to me again. And then don't change its position. Does that make sense from the way I described it on the other? Now I need to take this and save it as a separate document. So I'm going to just go over here and choose Save As. I'm going to put it on my desktop. And I'm going to save it in Photoshop file format. But I'm not going to save the layers, because we don't need those other parts that are in there. We just want this gray thing. So I'm just saying Photoshop file format, no layers. All right, I'm going to put this one other place. We don't need it to bend the flag in this other place, but we'll need it right afterwards. And that is, I'm going to put it in the Channels panel. So to put it in the Channels panel, I can select all and copy. And then I can go to channels if you happen to have it open on your screen. Otherwise, you'll have to go to the window menu to get to the channels panel. And at the bottom, there's a new channel icon. Same thing as the new layer icon. It's like a sheet of paper with the corner turned up. I'll click it, which will create a brand new channel. And then I'll choose paste. Okay, so in my channels panel, we have that. We'll need that to get the lighting. It's weird that it needs to be there, but it does. Now, anytime you've worked with channels, to get back to your normal image, you always click on the name up here, RGB. That means get me back to normal. All right, we got everything we need. What have we done? We got our flag on its own layer. We got some sort of backdrop for it. And we got this gray stuff we made. And we actually don't need that gray stuff anymore. I can throw it away because we got it saved in the two locations we need it. One is in a file on my hard drive. The other is in the channels panel. So now we can do what we wanted to do. I'm going to bend the flag. Filter, distort, displace. It's called a displacement map. The map is the file that I saved. So I'm going to choose displace. This comes up. The number you type in determines how severely it will bend the image. I'll leave it at the default of 10 just to show you what it would do, and then we'll change it if we need to. I'll click OK, and it's asking me for what's known as the map. So that's why I called my file, this is the map. But that's just that grayscale picture we saved. The map tells it how to bend the image. So I click Open, and then it should bend the image. Now it did. If I choose Undo, can you see a slight bend? But it's barely anything, isn't it? So let's choose Undo and try it one more time. And when we do this time, choose Displace. I'm going to type in, if 10 was only that little amount, what do you think? 50, 40, something like that? I'm just guessing. There's two numbers. You want to type them both in the same. Otherwise, you'll distort your image in only one direction, like horizontally, and it won't move it vertically at all. So anyway, I'll click OK, and I grab that file again. And now with 50, hopefully, it'll start looking more bent. It might even go higher than 50. Choose Undo. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a preview? 75. It's starting to look bent, isn't it? But it's all based on that grayscale picture. But the problem is there is no shading on it at all. So somehow I want to add shading. We're going to do that with a filter that's called lighting effects. Lighting effects, I can also feed a grayscale picture. And if I do, it will think of it as what's, I think might be known as a bump map, which means it thinks of it as describing the three-dimensionality of a surface. So it knows it's not lighting something that's flat. And it thinks the same way as this filter does. Now, the problem is when I try to use the filter, I think it's under Render, it's called Render Lighting Effects. The problem is that if I just come in here and use it, at the top you have various presets. We're just going to find one that looks like it's pointing light at that thing. Take me a minute to circle of light. No, not that thing. Jeez. Just looking for a very basic lighting. Maybe a flashlight. Well, we could use that, and I can actually move it. But right here on the right side is a choice called Texture. And if you click there, this is listing all the channels in your picture. And that's why we had to save that grayscale image also in the Channels panel. And so I'll choose Alpha 1. And then that means it thinks it's three-dimensional. And here's the height setting, which means how bent does it think it is. And I'll probably have to turn that way up. In fact, I'm not sure. It might be the same measurement system. And if so, didn't I use 75 on the image? And you see how it's adding some lighting? The problem is it will have a texture to it. Do you see the texture? So first, I should probably get a better light source. I can either modify this one by trying to pull on it and maybe make it bigger, maybe move it a little bit. I'm not a lighting effects guy as far as I don't use this on a daily basis by any means at all, but I know enough to make it give my images shading. So I'll set it up, and I'll click OK, but the problem is that we we got the noise in it. You see what it looks like? So we need to do something to get that on its own layer. Because if it's not on its own layer, I can blur it. Right now, if I blur, well, it's still attached to this layer, it's going to blur not only the lighting effect, but the flag. So let's try that once more. I'm actually going to throw away the choice called lighting effects in my layers panel. I want to do it to a separate layer on top. And we're going to have to get tricky. You know, we've gone through sessions on blending modes before, and we're going to use blending modes to get that on its own layer. Because what happens if I just create an empty layer, and that's where I want to put it, and I come down here and choose render and choose lighting effects, the only thing lighting effects can do is brighten or darken what you feed it. And what am I feeding it right now in my layers panel? Nothing. It's empty. So lighting effects can't work on an empty layer. We need a layer full of something. So we're going to cheat. When we talked about blending modes, there was an entire set of blending modes where 50% gray went away. And where anything brighter than 50% gray could brighten what's underneath. Anything that's darker than 50% gray could darken what's underneath. And those were blending modes like soft light, hard light, and overlay. There's a whole group. It's the biggest group of the blending modes. I don't know if you recall that or not, but we're going to use it. So here's what we're going to do. We'll get tricky. I'm going to create a brand new empty layer, which I would usually do by clicking on the new layer icon. But usually when you click there, it doesn't ask you to name the layer unless you hold on the Option key. I'm going to hold on Option this time. That's Alt in Windows, and I'll click. Now it'll ask me to name it, and I'll just call it lighting. But it also gives me a few other options, and what I'll do is choose one of those blending modes in that section where 50% gray goes away. The one I'll use is called hard light. Then there's something special below. Look what it says. Do we want to automatically fill the layer we're about to create with the color that disappears in hard light mode, which happens to be 50% gray? Yeah. So now what it's going to do here is not only create a brand new empty layer, it's going to fill the empty layer with 50% gray, and it's going to change the blending mode at the top of my layers panel to what I've asked for right there. So we're getting kind of fancy. When I click OK, we can confirm that. If you look in the layers panel, see it's full of 50% gray, set the hard light. So now let's go to Filter, Render, Lighting Effects, and let's see if it remembers. It remembers our setting. It doesn't see the flag because we're not working on the layer of the flag. Okay? It looks like it remembered all my settings, but you can get an idea right now. Doesn't that look pushed in? And so does maybe part of that, but that's where we were painting those different shades. I'm just going to click OK. And now because that layer is in hard light mode, the 50% gray just goes away. I see this, but you see all the texture, so all we're going to do is afterwards we're going to blur it to get all that texture to blur into the image. Until we can't see the texture anymore. There we go. Now the lighting effect is going beyond onto the black background. If we don't want it to, then we have to get even fancier. I know we're getting pretty fancy here. But do you remember the first time we talked about layers, we had some photographs sitting on top of some text. Somehow we got the photo to only show up inside the text, and when we were done, we had a down pointing arrow in that layer to indicate that this is clipped to what's under it. Well, in this case, we have a similar situation. We just happen to have our lighting on a layer. We want it to only show up where the flag is. And there were a couple different ways of doing it, but one was to go to the Layer menu and choose Create Clipping Mask. Now the lighting gets taken off of everything else. So now we've gotten our flag to be sitting there. And to make that animation, I repeated this process. And I actually did it in a somewhat automated way. I made sure the spacing of my paint strokes was even so that I could move them over instead of redrawing them. They'd be consistent. And when I was done, I put gray dots where they should have been attached. But it wasn't as hard as it might sound if you can think through a few features that help you. So if you ever have something that's flat and you want it to look like it's curved or there's an indent in it or it's sticking up or whatever, we can do this. And we can do this with things that you might not think of. I'm going to do it one more time. I'm not going to describe every single step because it just takes too long. And we'll take the same flag and we're going to bend it to conform to my face. Just grab that flag, I'll drag it over. We'll make it so maybe my eye's got the blue part of the flag on it. Okay, I want my eye showing through the one part of the flag. Okay, so we got that just right. Now, this is what will be interesting. You know how we had to have that grayscale image that described what's close to us, what's far away? I'm just going to use a copy of my face. It's not going to be accurate, but it'll be close enough to fool your eyes. I'll duplicate this image so we don't screw this one up. Under the image menu, we have the choice of duplicate. Then all I'm going to do is simplify it. I'm going to say, make it black and white. Get rid of all my layers. I'm going to then look at my face, and do you see my pores? They're darker than my skin, aren't they? Don't dark things mean they're further away? So that means drill holes in my head is what they're going to act like. So I'm going to blur this to smooth it out enough so that my pores go away. So it thinks of my face as instead being smooth. About like that. And I'm going to save that in Photoshop file format wherever I can remember it. So what did I do? Duplicated the image, made it black and white, blurred it until the fine detail went away. Okay? Then I can close it. Now let's bend a flag. Got our flag, go to Filter, Distort, Displace. I don't know, that might be too much. It's hard to say. Let's find out. I'm going to use 50. I just think it might be too much. Okay. Click OK. It'll ask me for the file. It's right there. Now, it's hard to tell if that's right or not. That just looks weird, doesn't it? So let's apply it to my face as if it was ink. Isn't that what one of these blending modes does? It's the one called multiply. And if you look at where the ridge of my nose is, and look at what the flag is doing. Is it not going right up the ridge? And right here where it's coming down, it's not exactly right, but look, it's coming right down where the cheek is. It's close enough to fool things. So now the only thing I might do is hide the flag and select the sky that's back here. Go back to my flag, and I might hide it in those areas. I'll add a layer mask. I'll hold Option to say hide instead of keep the selected. And I might also grab my paintbrush, and with the paintbrush active, I might come in and get it off my eyeballs, because that would be a painful tattoo. I need to paint with black, though. I can't see my eyeball, so I'll get rid of it over the whole thing. And then I'll switch and paint with white. Bring it back. There we go. Doesn't that look weird? That could be anything, though. It doesn't have to be a flag. This could be a car, and you have wood. You want it to look like a car made out of wood. All right, that can work. Because most of the time, the highlights in the shadows on three-dimensional objects are close enough to define their shape. It won't work for every single thing you ever try it on, but it'll work for an amazing number of things that you wouldn't otherwise assume it would. You got to experiment, okay? So in this case, to apply it, I used multiply mode, but we could experiment with the other modes. Maybe I use overlay. That's a little too much. I think in general, though, the bright, if I use these modes, remember there are white stripes in the flag, and things brighter than 50% gray will brighten. So I think those will be too much. But maybe some of these, if I just use darken or one of the others, you can actually experiment. If you're in the Move tool, Shift and plus. Oh, I like that one. What's that? Color burn. If it's too much, lower the opacity. Uh-huh. But like I say, cars and other objects, I've done this too, and it works great. All right, then I did tell you that I would tell you how to create a perspective grid. So let's do that, because remember when we had the bus, and we were putting it on there, and I wasn't exactly certain what angle to do things at? So here is how to do a perspective grid. This is not something I do every day, so I probably won't do it in the most efficient way possible, but I'll show you what I'm thinking about. If you look at a flat surface within this photograph, let's say the side of the building, you can see how it's being distorted by perspective in that this line here is going off. If you were to continue it, you could imagine it going off into the distance if this building was deeper. Well, if you were to do that with this line here and do it with another line that would be parallel to this line in real life, meaning you see this green line up here, don't you think that is on the same angle as this in real life? Well, if I were to do that and continue it on and keep going and going and going to the right, eventually those two lines would connect into what's known as the vanishing point of that surface. Does that make sense? We want to find that vanishing point. And I'm going to do it by creating a new layer, and I can use all sorts of tools. I'm going to use the line tool that's down here in my shape tool. You can see it. Line tool. And with the line tool up here, I can tell it the weight. I'll make it, I don't know, 9 pixels. And let's choose my fill, whatever. You can set it up however you'd like. Then what I'm going to do is trace over that bottom edge where the building is. And I'm just going to draw this line, but I'm going to draw it until it goes way beyond the edge of my document over here. And I'm going to move it up and down until it's parallel with the bottom of the building. Okay? And this is better to do on a large screen because you can be zoomed up more. But I'm going to do that. Let go. You see my line? Then I'm going to click on the green line that was up there. I'll click on one edge, and I'll pull way out beyond the edge of my document. And again, I'll get it to line up. Does that look about right? What we have just found is the vanishing point of this image. Now I can't see where those two cross because when I drew this, at the top of your screen you can tell it this means, if you hover over this, it tells you what it means, path operations, and if you click, it means everyone should create a new layer. If I had had this set to this, both lines would be in the same layer, so I could still see them both beyond the edge of the document. I'll hit delete to get rid of that one. I'll just redo that top one with the tool up here set to combine shapes, meaning don't create a new layer every time. So then I can do this and get it to line up. I'm looking at the building. All right, so right there is my vanishing point for that particular surface. I can then show my rulers. And I can click on a ruler and pull out a guide to mark where the vanishing point is located. So it's easy for me to find it. And then all I need to do is draw lines all starting from that exact point and make them equally spaced as I go up. So what I can do is go to View, and I'm going to choose Show Grid. So there's my grid, and I can get rid of the lines we already have and create new ones because they don't necessarily line up with exactly how far I want these, or I can keep them because right now they look like they're close to hitting the grid lines right where the edge of this building is. But I can just draw lines now from the vanishing point, and I want to make them equally spaced on the grid. So I'll go up, let's say, 2 notches on the grid each time. Then I'll draw from the vanishing point 2 notches up the grid. Then I'll draw on the vanishing point, from the vanishing point, 2 notches up on the grid. Is that 2? Yeah, 2. And I'll just keep doing that. 2 notches each time. So I need to get rid of that other line up there. I should have deleted it. Right now it would be messy to select it. So ignore the one line that was already up there. But if I were to do this, going an equal amount up each time, this is a perspective grid. And let me turn off the grid I've been using. And we would need to, I'm not sure if I'll be able to easily select this, but that one extra line, It is this one right here. See if I can get rid of it. We'll find out. Yeah, okay. I was able to click on it with the what's called the direct selection tool, which is this guy here, and hit delete for that one we didn't need. But anyway, this grid can be useful. I'll also come in here and clear my, or at least hide my guides. Okay. Now, let's say I had something that I needed to put in this image, and I wanted it to look as if the surface of something was parallel with the side of that building. Well, I would want the angle of the top and bottom, just like the top and bottom of my bus, to line up with these lines, to be parallel with the lines as they get close to it. And if so, the perspective would look right. Or let's say I wanted to put something in my picture that was about the same height as this object in the background, but I want to put it closer to the camera. And I don't know how big it should look when it gets closer to the camera. Well, I count how many of these lines I made tall is that object. For now, we'll even pay attention to the little spikes coming out of it and say it's what? 1, 2, just under 3 lines tall. So that means if I want to put it near the front of the building, I go just under 3 lines tall. So it would have to be 1, 2, just under that. It would have to be this tall, starting right there, to look to be the same size as that one with the perspective that's in this image. And you can extend these lines off to infinity going the other way. I just wasn't zoomed out on my document far enough. You can also do it to more than one surface of your image. So if I did the same thing here, drawing a red line across the bottom of this building and extending it way out beyond the edge, and then I took this top line up here and did the same thing, they would cross eventually, somewhere outside the document usually. And I could make the other grid going this way, so that if there was a surface that should be parallel to the front of the building, I can figure out what angle would it be at. And if I wanted something to be just as tall as this pump, but I want it to be way over here, I would count the same number of lines high when I get way over there, and I would go the same number. I would be able to figure out how big it should be. I don't know if that makes too much sense to you. It all depends how much you're used to thinking about three-dimensional space. Okay? And I'd usually put that on its own layer so I can just turn it off and on whenever I need it. So most of the time it'd be turned off, but when I need to size something to make sure it looks like it's the right size, I could use it. But that's known as a perspective grid. And that's what I could have done right here when I had my bus there. Then I would be able to tell what angle should things be at. I could do one grid for this surface of the thing and the other grid for either this or this surface to figure out what the front and the sides of the bus should be. Well, this has been thinking about how to warp, bend, liquify, and do all sorts of things to our layers. You don't always need to use it for what I just showed you. Oftentimes you need to bend things when you're doing retouching. I'm retouching, I need to put something on top of something else, but it just doesn't line up quite right. So as I showed you the other day, you can use something like puppet warping, but it's not always puppet warping. Sometimes it's the normal kind of warping I use to put something on a coffee mug. Sometimes it's any of these choices. It's not always to make a special effect. It's sometimes to do very practical things, like when you're doing retouching, and I can only copy from this particular part of the image because it's the only clean material that looks like what I need. But it needs to appear over here in a completely different angle and bend and all this stuff. Well, then you need to use some of these choices. So let's think about tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about advanced layers. So today we got into a few little advanced things with layers, like when I created a brand new layer that was automatically full of 50% gray, was automatically in hard light mode, and we were getting kind of fancy in there. But tomorrow we get to explore all the interesting features that are hidden away in our layers panel that make it much more powerful. But before then, why don't you head over to the Facebook group? If you haven't been in it yet, this is the web address to go to find it. You do have to ask to join it by clicking the button there. We'll approve you pretty quick, and then you can come in and ask whatever questions. And if you use something like the displace filter, for instance, to bend something, and you have an interesting example, why don't you upload it and share it with everybody else? You'll get feedback, and if you have questions about it, you'll get answers, all that kind of stuff. It's a great community to be in. We had it for a whole month for our Lightroom group. We had close to 3,000 people in there, and I think, well, everybody's begging not to shut it down at the end of that group because they found it to be so useful. So be sure to get over there into the Facebook group. It's a private group, so whatever you post in there is only seen by group members. So a lot of your clients and other people that usually visit your Facebook page won't see it unless they happen to be watching this class and get in there. And finally, if you want to find me on the web, here are various choices. I had mentioned those pictures of my wife doing yoga around the world. The bottom choice right there, that's where you can find her on Instagram. You'll see a whole bunch of those images. This has been another installment of Photoshop CC, the complete guide. I hope to see you next time.